My guest today is Eric Oglesbee. He is a school founder turned funder. Eric helped to launch River Montessori High School in South Bend, Indiana, that is currently the only high school in the Wildflower Montessori Microschool Network. Wildflower, as listeners may recall, is a microschool network that started back in 2014 to help activate teacher entrepreneurs and enable them to build small, accessible, inclusive Montessori schools. There are now dozens of Wildflower Montessori microschools across the US. And in Puerto Rico, I've featured many of the founders on this podcast. And so after Eric helped to launch that high school, he joined the Drexel Fund in 2022. And the Drexel Fund is a nonprofit venture philanthropy fund that provides seed funding to new private schools that are focused on low-income students and children with learning differences. And then they also provide next stage funding to schools and school networks that have demonstrated success. Eric Oglesbee, welcome to the Liberated Podcast.
Thanks, Gary. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm so glad that you're here. I love kind of combining these two stories of founding a school and becoming an education entrepreneur, and then funding through philanthropy some of these education entrepreneurs, because I think both of those are of interest to my listeners and viewers, and you've been able to wear both hats. So you are uniquely positioned to talk about these issues. So let's start, though, with your background in education. Tell us a little bit about that and your pathway to education entrepreneurship, being a school founder.
Yeah, so I would definitely say I was an accidental education entrepreneur in my life. I think maybe it's an accident for all of us. It started though, I was originally in higher education. So my PhD is in linguistics, and I taught at a small liberal arts college, taught across 3 disciplines. So I taught mathematics, linguistics, freshman writing. Absolutely loved it. So I've always just been kind of interested in lots of things. And I thought I was going to be in higher ed for the rest of my life. Like I planned to, the school I was at, it was my alma mater. I was going to be there until I was too slow to cross the street and I'd get hit by a car on my way to work. Like that was what I thought. But then some things changed. I think a lot happens for those of us who get into trying to figure out how education can be different. I have 2 children, one of whom is on the autism spectrum. And we start off in public school because public school is what you do. It's like, hey, I sign my kid for public school. He goes to the school that's nearby me. They're going to be able to take care of him. This is because it worked great for me. It worked great for my wife. Didn't even think a second thing about it. And then kindergarten was like, oh, this went a little bit rough. And then first grade was, oh my, this is getting really difficult. And then in second grade, the wheels came off, and my son was getting sent home almost every day by 9 o'clock. There was the dreaded call from the school, and we ended up pulling him out. We homeschooled for a little bit, and that wasn't for us. And then we stumbled across this amazing private Montessori school that was for like age 3 through grade 8. I took a tour, and I was blown away. But I might get slightly emotional at times in stories here. I was almost in tears coming away from it though, because I'm like, how in the world do we afford this? Like although Indiana has choice scholarship vouchers, the school didn't participate and just felt profoundly trapped. And so some things happened that we actually figured out that my wife was able to go from being stay-at-home mom to being a full-time professor at Notre Dame, which of course everybody can do, right? Like they can go have that happen, and that helped us pay for the school. But even just that being so trapped and having that happen, I was like, no family should ever feel that way. And so that was in the back of my head. And then there was this one day where when I was teaching at a math class at the university that I was at, and there was a student there as a part of something called a REACH program, which is where high school students could take college courses and things. And the student was just asking me these amazing questions that were super insightful in the class. And I afterwards stopped them and said, hey, have you had this before? Because your questions are fantastic. You're getting this differently. And she's like, oh, no. And I was like, oh, I didn't even think anything of it. And then one evening I was at a parent night at my son's Montessori school that we got him into. And I looked down the row and I see this student sitting there. And I'm like, what are you doing here? She's like, oh, this is where I went to school. I'm like, really? and then went on to learn that she'd actually dropped out of high school and was constructing a high school education from visiting from 3 different area colleges and so forth. And so I was seeing sort of all these different pieces of, I saw that, and I saw my other freshmen, I was seeing a lot of them that just were not prepared to be self-directed learners in college. And so between putting all these pieces together, my own of like, where's my son going to go to high school? Why are we doing high school in such a way that this student is being able to be so high performing in my classroom? Why can't our students have this? No family should be trapped. Stir that all together, and I'm like, if I don't do something about this, who is going to do something about it? So 2 weeks into my first year as a tenured professor, I walked into my academic dean's office and said, I'm resigning, and here's why. And so I taught out the rest of my semester and all kinds of things, but I knew I needed to start down the path to bring a Montessori high school into existence in my community, for my son, for those who also felt trapped by what was there. And yeah, so then there was just a long, windy road from there. That was 2015 when I resigned, and then River opened in fall of 2020. And there's lots of steps on the process there I could talk about, but yeah,
Yeah.
that was the initial journey.
I want to talk a little bit more about the startup process, but I just want to spend a few minutes on this bold step. I mean, you had received tenure, you're a few weeks into your tenure position, like you said, someplace that you felt like you could stay for decades. And then to quit, to leave that, to become an entrepreneur, I mean, that's such a huge leap. Did it feel really scary at the time, or were you just so focused on building, on being an
Oh,
entrepreneur that it kind of overshadowed that fear?
oh, absolutely terrified. Anyone who says like, "Oh no, I just stepped out and did it," and says they're not afraid, I'm like, "What's wrong with you? You should be terrified." But I mean, we can be terrified and still know that the right, there's a thing that we need to do. And a lot of credit goes to my wife, Lisa. So at this point, she'd been at Notre Dame for a year with this, and um, it was through her support and having that position that we were able to train, that she provided the stability financially, and also just the emotional support to say, yes, we have this opportunity. You need to do this. So I actually became a development director at my son's Montessori school for a year and a half, developed a consortium of Montessori schools while I was there, to try to advance Montessori education things, all with it in the mind of being like, these are steps that are also going to help to bring this high school around. And I had actually a voice analytics tech startup at one point mixed in there too, but that's, we don't have to
Good.
go
So
down that.
you had some other kind of entrepreneurial inclinations at the time that were helping you. And I'm sure just this sense of wanting to build something, like you said, solve a problem for your family and others in your community. So what were some of the key steps from the idea stage of I need to build a Montessori high school in my community to launch? What were some of those sort of key highlights for you?
Well, a key step was like building a community that's interested in it. And I scream this from the rooftops of anyone who has an idea of trying to innovate in education, is that it is not a solo act, that you have to understand what is the gap in my community, and is this really a gap? Is this just a gap that I see, or is this a
Mm.
gap that others sees? And also, there's so much involved in launching school that you're going to need funding expertise, you're going to need real estate expertise, you're going to need, fill in the blank expertise. And so, the first key step was saying, we want to do this, because some people like feel bashful. I think they almost feel like when someone is like, I'm going to write a book, and they feel bashful about telling others that they're going to write a book to share this passion idea, because people think, oh, you're being cute. Oh, sure. I'm not sure if you ran into that when you're like, you know what, I'm going to write a book on this or not, when it came to unschooling, but like um, getting to that point of like, no, this is something that's happened. So the very tangible thing is in January of 2016, so a few months after turning my resignation, we started a focus group for a feasibility study that we pulled together current and former parents of the school we were at, some current and former board members, other community members, and spent 4 months saying, what are the big questions that need to be answered here? Because that's the other part. It's like questions are the driver to getting something out there, because it's so easy to have this idea in our head of what this should look like, but to be afraid of letting others ask questions of it and then go to find those answers to those questions. And so we did that, and over those 4 months, we really identified a lot of the key key problems that would have to be solved for Montessori High School, which there are lots of those problems. Um, and then spent the next couple of years answering those questions.
And did you affiliate with the Wildflower Network right out of the gate, or how did that partnership come about?
That was an accidental bumping into each other event. So the conclusion I'd come to, and this sounds kind of funny, after this feasibility study as we're writing it, is that a small scale Montessori school is not going to be able to be led in a traditional manner. It's going to be lots of people wearing different hats and kind of doing the administration of it, that teachers are leading the school. And I did not get that from the Wildflower website. That was just like, when you looked at all the problems that had to be solved, I'm like, that's the solution. And then I've actually even can't even remember how we bumped into each other. I think it was somebody who, when I was building the Montessori Consortium of the Great Lakes, uh, toured the Montessori school I was at, and then out of the blue, a year later, was just like, hey, there's this Wildflower thing. We're going to be affiliating with them. Like, tell me more. And they're like, and they're interested potentially in high school sometime. And I'm like, tell me much more. And so it went from there. And so that's how I kind of bumped into it. And we looked at each other, and we probably, you could ask Matt Kramer this sometimes, the CEO of Wildflower, if this is true or not. I think we leapfrogged strategically where they were at by about a decade, because at the time they were almost all primary classrooms and lower elementaries, which for those who aren't familiar with Montessori, that's basically up through third grade, that there were inklings of potentially middle school programs. And they did have the high school in Puerto Rico, but that was sort of its own critter at that time, a little idiosyncratic sort of, I think, member of the network with that. And so, when we came along, they were like, you know what, we are philosophically aligned, go for it. And so we actually affiliated with them formally. We were going to be South Bend Montessori High School. And so they're like, well, we're Wildflower Network. We need a name change. And I negotiated. I'm like, can we be a geographic feature instead of a tree? And they granted us river. So that's how we ended up. I think we were the first non-plant in the network for school.
Oh, that's so great. And so you launched when? When did the high school officially open?
Oh, and the best time ever, fall of 2020, in the middle of a pandemic.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a little hard to recruit over Zoom, but we did launch in fall 2020, and we were originally going to start with just ninth grade and then add a grade each year. But about a month before school started, we had a number of 10th grade families that they're like, look, we know you weren't playing 10th grade yet, but whatever you do will be better than what we can do at home. And and with adolescents need to be around each other. And we were going to be in person while everyone else is virtual. And they're like, would you take them? So a month before we opened, we accelerated our curriculum development by a year and took a small set of 10th graders to join us. So.
And what does the school look like now? I know you're no longer kind of a part of the day-to-day operations in your new role at Drexel, but what is the school sort of size at this point?
Yeah. So it's in its fourth year, and there's 41 students across grades 9 through 12. Last year, we had 3 graduates out of that first little pioneering class. One was a National Merit Scholar finalist. One was a National Merit Scholar commended student. Another was a direct admit into the IU School, Jacobs School of Music. And we use the Mastery Transcript Consortium, if folks are familiar with that. And that Mastery Transcript diploma, actually, the portfolio elements of that were incredibly compelling. That got this student a scholarship. So it's going fantastic. And in fact, the neat thing about the school is that our school is designed to be a jumping off point to community resources. So this year, especially, students are as juniors and seniors by themselves navigating the city during the school day, going to the South Bend Museum of Art for ceramics, and going to IUSB or to St. Mary's or to Bethel during the school day, or going to work early, having that kind of flexibility.
So I want to jump to your role from founder to funder in just a minute. But before we do that, just one last point about Montessori. The Montessori educational philosophy, of course, named after Maria Montessori, focused very much on child-centered learning, kind of learner-driven or interest-driven learning in these beautiful spaces. And correct me if I'm wrong, but most Montessori schools in the US at least are more kind of early childhood or elementary school levels. There's not as many Montessori high schools in the US. So, what is the high school Montessori approach? What does that look like?
Oh man, I'll try to be succinct on it. It is very much about, again, following. I'm going to say follow the student instead of follow the child. When I call them children, they don't care for that. Amazingly, as adolescents, no, but follow the student. Um, so this is going to be interesting. We have to operate within Indiana's Core 40 diploma structure. So we do have classes, but what we've done is that we have multi-age classrooms where students have a base of knowledge they're presented, but they have an incredible amount of latitude to go deeper in that knowledge and choice and how they expose what content they cover and how they express that knowledge back to the guide. So in that sense, that's why we're following with what happened previously. But another element of school is that every student has passion projects that are built into the curriculum. And these don't have to be quote unquote academic projects. So to give you an example, my son is doing a passion project on bringing a Super Smash Bros. Esports tournament, a biweekly tournament to South Bend. There's already some other tournaments there. And you might think, what does esports video games tournaments have to do with education? Well, last week, we've been meeting weekly. He's writing a grant proposal for a local grant to be able to fund this thing. So he's learning how to analyze a potential funder and see how does what I'm doing align with their funding priorities. He's done things like meet with a potential venue, like schedule an appointment and go see them during the school day and propose what he's doing and try to negotiate a rate for it to be able to do it. So all these very real, tangible skills that you don't get out of a traditional environment. And it's what's been, for me as a parent, wonderful to see is that his seeing success in this passion project turns over into success in his schoolwork. And so I think that is right in line with Maria Montessori, both with the self-directed learning, but also her emphasis on real work, that education isn't play. It's real work, and it's the maximal work a student can do at the particular age that they're at. So, and there's
I
also,
love it.
not many Montessori schools. I think I found less than 30 in the US when I was doing my initial feasibility study. And I felt like I was being pretty generous with what I was categorizing as a high school when I was doing it. Like there's just not a lot out there.
Why do you think that is? Do you have any theories?
Oh, I have many theories. I think parents, we as parents like love the idea and concept of self-directed learning and these non-traditional approaches at younger ages. And I think because there's this little voice in the back of our head that says, well, if this doesn't work, I have time to catch up. Or the stakes really do, I mean, there's very important high stakes stuff happening early. Like I'm not saying that is the case. Like there's high stakes stuff happening early in education, but I think that's a reflex of parents of that I'm willing to take a risk on this at elementary. I will take less of a risk at middle school, but even if things kind of go a little sideways, they'll be corrected in high school. By the time you get to high school, it's such high stakes, or is perceived as high stakes in such a way of like, I've got one shot. So, and this is the path to success I've seen others. And I'm not going to be able to live with myself as a parent if I choose something that's going to send my kid a different direction and not have the kind of success they want. So I think that's one, from a parent perspective, at least, big driver of why we don't see Montessori schools or Montessori high schools or schools like them. And the other is, I think cost is a barrier. I think this kind of education requires a smaller staff to student ratio with it. That is frankly kind of expensive. And so that kind of becomes difficult unless you get creative, which I think we've gotten creative, and I'm pretty excited about it. That's why I like being part of Wildflower Network, is I think we now have a way to sort of broadcast these things that we're learning to other schools. And my vision is that I think I want to see teams of teachers be able to come together, do micro schools, Montessori or not, with the things that we're learning to meet needs in our communities.
Yeah, so that's a perfect segue now into your role at Drexel Fund and kind of how you got into that. Tell us a little bit about what made you decide to move from founder to funder.
Yeah, so when I started the process of launching a high school, I told my co-founder, which again, you need lots of people to start a school. Nobody does it alone. I told my co-founder, I said, hey, I'm in this with you to get this off the ground, and I'll be with you for the first 2 years. But for a lot of reasons, I think we need to sort of phase me out of it. One of which was that in the Wildflower model, there's no like sort of single leader of a school. it's a co-leading situation, and everybody viewed me as like the leader, and I'm like, that's not healthy. So I'm like, we have to force my exit in some capacity. But so it was like upfront, I'm just a teacher at heart. It was hard to step away from higher ed, and I really have been drawn to like wanting to help others to be able to do this. And so it was a perfect marriage of things, because when we opened River, I applied to something called the Founders Program at the Drexel Fund, which, spoiler alert, I'm now the director of, to have a 1-year paid fellowship to get basically a salary and a budget to do additional learning and development for a year to open River Montessori. And so so the Drexel Fund funded me for a fellowship year. They gave my school a 2-year startup grant. And then when I was in that second year, they called me and said, hey, we've learned that you're going to be working to phase yourself out. Would you be interested in phasing yourself in to what we do? And I said, absolutely, because they are, the Drexel Fund's in its 9th year as a venture philanthropy organization. And their whole mission is to create high quality seats in private schools that serve low income kids. And so it just checked every one of my boxes for me. And in the 3 years of working with them, it's a special thing when you encounter an organization that you read their mission statement and then you see them live it behind the scenes. So that's how I came to Drexel.
Amazing. And I love that you're now leading this Founders Fellowship program that you were a beneficiary of. And it's great timing for us to be having this conversation because the deadline for the next cohort of fellows is coming up March 1st. So any listeners and viewers who are interested in becoming a private school founder, kind of focused on low-income students or those with learning differences and want to apply for this 1-year fellowship with a year-long stipend and support to get their program off the ground, should definitely go ahead and apply for that. I wonder if there's any more info you can share about that fellowship.
Absolutely. So, yep, the deadline for the first round is March 1st. And so what it is that there's a series of questions on our website that you run through that are a little bit about your school model, where you're at in the process. I will say that our Founders Fellowship is for people who are down the road, kind of like I was, that it's not somebody who's just at the idea stage. We have stuff for that, which I could talk more about, and kind of some of the work I do there. But this is for that person that they're somewhat like I was, where I was like, come hell or high water, I was on the path to opening a school. And I'd already done things like starting to pull together a founding team. And we had a rudimentary business plan. And we were taking all these tangible actions to bring the school into business. That is somebody who is a good candidate for our founders program. And so the application process, though, is that we have an online application, a first round, where you get your resume and some questions. And if you advance to the next round, you end up having a longer design document and coming up with a budget that you have to propose. And then there's a third round, because we love our due diligence at the Drexel Fund, where you end up having a live interview and some other elements. And so we'll be looking in the next 2 months to finalize our founders. So it's not going to be a submit by March 1st and you'll hear back in 3 months. It's this fellowship starts July 1st and it's a cohorted experience. And if you're looking to be opening doors in fall of 2025 in one of our target states. So you can look on our website what states are our target states that we fund in. It can be a great fit for someone. I will say for myself that while I was on the path to opening, I was within probably a couple months of thinking this just can't happen, because I'd literally spent years trying to get this thing. And then I again stumbled onto the Drexel Fund, applied, got into the founders program, and the rest is history on that.
Amazing. Okay, so listeners and viewers, you have to be a little bit further along than just having an idea. You have to be actively planning to launch a school, but then go ahead and apply for the Founders Program at Drexel and hopefully see if that works out. But you mentioned that you also provide some support for idea stage founders, people really early on. Tell me a little bit about that.
So we actually just finished our set of sessions for this school year, but starting back again in October, is that every month we have a school startup information session for entrepreneurs, where we talk a little bit about the Drexel Fund, what our funding priorities are, how it works, but also then have a presentation on what we see as being the pillars of school startup. Because again, asking yourself questions and being asked questions, this is how you move a project like this forward. And what we do is that out of those sessions, there's an opportunity to fill out a follow-up survey where we reach out and we contact every person who does a follow-up survey to see where they're at and see if we have any micro grant opportunities to attend, say, work like these small private workshops we do, where we just recently had one on refining one school model and thinking about building graduate profile. Upcoming, I'll be doing one on developing the school financial model. You know, everybody's favorite thing, money. And then we also have micro grants. You know, examples of micro grants we've given is that maybe somebody just really needs to go see a couple of different schools to get more inspiration for the model. We've done micro grants for that. And so we, in our early stage work, we really try to meet a person where they're at and say, what is something that we can help do to like nudge just a little bit further forward in the process? Because to me, at least, it meant so much just even being asked to apply for the Founders Program and to be told, well, you are crazy if you want to start a school. We can just put that out there. Like, you are crazy, but it's the kind of crazy that the world needs. And so like to have somebody say, hey, you're a little crazy, but you're the kind of crazy that we want to hear more. And that's very helpful, because I think starting a school can feel like one of the most lonely things in the world, which is one of the reasons why in our fellowship program, it's a cohort experience. Like right now, I'm actually sitting in the Link School in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, with one of my founders fellows from last year, visiting her school in year one with my cohort of founders this year. And they're in another room right now learning about assessment and how to practically engage in it. And the thing I loved is that this was actually not a planned in-person meeting. But when a couple of them said they were interested in school, I was like, we need to have another one. And because I was sensing in them that they have teams, but they were feeling alone as the entrepreneur and driver. And just to be in proximity to others who, even if their schools are wildly different from what you're opening, are all going through the same things, is a powerful support. I still text with my friends from the Founders Fellowship.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah, that cohort experience, especially when you're going through something just so so big as being an entrepreneur, such a leap into a new enterprise, can be such a rewarding experience. And I can imagine it being very close knit among the founders there. So Eric, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that you hear from founders pre-launch? This could be idea stage founders or those who might be a little bit further along. What are some of their main challenges?
This is going to sound incredibly boring, but facilities.
Location, location, right?
Yep. Oh, absolutely. So I mean, even right now, one of my founders who we are here, that she thought she had everything lined up and everything. And last night she's like, hey, I may have to step in and out of meetings tomorrow. We just run into a zoning snarl with what we're doing. And I mean, last year with, well, even with Sarah, that the location that we're sitting in right now, this was not the original target location. And it kind of happened through a long series of things. And so it's so boring, but if you're interested in starting a school, start looking. Like, I spent 2.5 years trying to find where we were going to open River. And where we opened was a place that I walked at the first time we looked at it. I walked out and looked at Eileen, I said, we found our plan F. She's like, plan F? Not B or C? I was like, no, plan F. If we open here, we up. And she was like, oh yeah, no, but like, you don't know, like you realize it's like so hard. And it turns out it's actually the perfect location that you have to like peel away these pre-expectations you bring to it, because we do always start like, my school, like we were looking at like mansion houses, because the Montessori's high schools that existed were in mansion houses and things like that. And like the school startup process in part is about peeling away the onion of the unnecessary expectations for things that have to be there, and getting down to that core of like, what is the minimum viable product? What is the identity of my school? And then building back out from there, and that telling you about where I should be, who I should hire, what kinds of grades am I going to start with? Those decisions. So there's a little piece of advice though. It does come back to facilities. It's never too early to start looking. And it's never too early to become friends with your fire marshal. I'll say that.
Yeah, and that persistence, right? Looking at a lot of different locations, querying a lot of different people to find out what's possible. So just sort of sticking to it. So, Eric, you mentioned that Drexel funds high quality seats in private schools. And of course, quality or high quality is a subjective term. So, I'd love to know how Drexel defines that.
So operationally, when we look at high quality, we look at we do use standardized assessments to benchmark across things because we operate in a whole number of different states, so we can't it's not apples to apples to look at state exams between two different states. But we really like the NWEA MAP assessment. Uh, and one reason we like it is that it's not just about um, looking at percentile rankings, because we see how much percentile rankings on these exams are correlated to socioeconomic status. But we through multiple presentations, like a fall and a spring presentation of this test, you can look at student growth within it. And this growth takes into account where does a student start? And it has a predicted growth of what they should achieve at that grade level. And so we're very, very interested in like what percentage of students meet or exceed growth targets within a school. And so we also within our schools, depending upon the population being served, is that we will benchmark our expectations for our grantees based upon what kind of population they have. That we're a very conversational fund. It's not like we take everybody's application, drop it into a machine, and it spits out a number we do, and here's a particular benchmark. But we look really, really closely at the educational model and the population being served, and what is a high performing school for where this school is going to be at. Um, yeah, so I think I was very general and very specific all at the same time there.
Yeah, and I mean, tell us about the sort of the diversity of the private schools that you're funding. Are they, do they have a range of educational philosophies and approaches? Different kinds of communities that they're serving. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the answer is yes. No, the so I mean some examples. Let's look at we'll start with even just my founders from last year. So of the founders last year, three of them received startup grants. One is a joint Judaic studies, traditional studies school near the Fort Lauderdale area. Another is a classical school, not a Christian classical. You often see Christian classical. You see those two terms concatenated a lot, but this one's one that's built that uses the Hillsdale curriculum, but is not part of the Hillsdale ones. Another one that was funded last year is the Link School where I'm at, which is a project-based learning elementary school in Baton Rouge with a large outdoor garden. Sarah said, "Bring your boots when you come," and that was a good suggestion. Uh, throughout the wider portfolio, we've have, I mean, basically pick a school type, and I feel like we've kind of got it. So we talk about the Drexel Fund. We're a model agnostic organization, just that we care about schools that are that have a clear vision of who they are high performing, are serving an underserved population. And within that also have a strong character development thing. So people ask me, they're like, are all the schools religious schools? I'm like, well, there are some Catholic schools, there are some Jewish schools, there have been some Muslim schools that are within the portfolio. I'm like, and then there's like my high school doesn't have a religious affiliation to it. It has character development in a different way. So in short, we're a pretty diverse family.
I love it. So, Eric, I think you said that it was in the fall of 2015 that you started ideating on opening a school, and now, of course, we're almost a decade later. What have you seen over the past near decade in kind of alternative education, and where do you think we're going in this space?
So I think what we saw, and this is not a shock to anyone, the pandemic kind of rung everyone's bell and opened the window to say, wait, education doesn't have to be the way it was done previously. There's some things here I like. And so I think the micro school movement, which I would love to see it if we could actually find a way to define micro school a little bit better, because I have folks talk to me about a micro school and they say, yeah, 200 to 300 students. And I'm like, okay, that's your definition of micro school. I always have to ask how many students you're talking about. But I do think this sort of small scale education approach that has more community-based embedded learning, that is not about being a factory assembly line, I think that's here to stay. That is kind of our moment that we're in right now. I'll be interested to see how, if what happens is that we seed all these sort of smaller models and that they're going to grow into being, um, some of them are just going to fade away, and we're going to grow into more established, larger schools again. That's going to sort of be like that you put the cream in your coffee, that Brownian motion of the cream sort of up through that. We're going to get back to the point where we were pre-pandemic again, but we just have more academic models in larger institutional settings. I kind of wonder if we're going to head that direction. But I also think, though, something that's happened, I'm not sure if you've seen this as you've talked to folks, the window for innovation has also closed in a way pretty rapidly since the pandemic, that as the pandemic has gotten more into the rearview mirror, that people are shifting back to the traditional models, and that our day in the sun didn't necessarily shove us completely in a different direction, but that what it did, it created a bigger minority schooling culture that's not going to go away, as opposed to revolutionizing the whole system. That's my 2 cents on it at this point.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I feel like certainly in certain locations, microschooling and these innovative models, I think are just accelerating. I was just in Tennessee recently visiting microschool founders there. All of them have started since 2020, and most of them have started in the past 18 months. So I see, sort of an acceleration of these new models, but I think there's so much uncertainty about what the future holds. And I think that's an interesting point I hadn't thought about before. Are we just going to get bigger, diverse schools, right? Like, is that the pathway forward for private education? I don't know.
Well, I would say one thought that's occurred to me. So, like, my own story is this high school came about. It was first driven by my own interest for my own child. And I feel like I do run into a lot of micro school founders that, not all of them, but a lot of them is driven about needs for their own children. And I wonder what happens as their children
Mm,
age out of this. Do others pick up the mantle and continue this and they perpetuate? Or is that the point at which we start seeing it closing down? So that's where, like, for me,
mm.
about 10 years from now, I'll be really curious to look back and see what micro schools make it to their second generation or their third generation of leadership. Uh, to me, that's the interesting question.
Yeah, and that's where Drexel is also trying to get ahead of the pack there, right? In providing next stage grant funding for successful schools that are already established, for networks of schools, so that there is that model of sustainability and scale. Do you sort of see yourself and your organization as contributing to kind of the long-term success of these models?
I think so. This is where I don't speak for Drexel policy at this point. I'm a program director on this, but when I look at it, I see some of what we're doing is finding those smaller school models that have those characteristics that say that that is going to be around for a while, and that replicates well elsewhere. Because if you have a network supporting and not just as a one-off, like, that's how the small schools are going to get their sustainability, because they're a network. You can draw in other talent or have network-wide talent that steps in during interms when you have to have transitions to keep something going.
Yeah. Well, this is all great work that you're doing at Drexel. Eric, what is the best way for my listeners and viewers to find out more about the Drexel Fund, the upcoming fellowship? The deadline is quickly approaching. How can they reach out?
Going to our website, drexelfund.org, is a great place to start. In fact, there's like a yellow banner at the top. You click on it, it'll take you to the Founders Program page where you can go to apply. Um, you can also, this is dangerous to me, but I'm the kind of person who answers every email that comes to me. It may take me a little while, but people could email directly at eric@drexelfund.org. I'm happy to point you to the right person if I'm not the right person within the organization. It's just my passion to be able to help others walk down the path to make a difference for kids. So
Well, we appreciate your passion and wish you well with this next cohort of the Founders Fund and everything that you're doing to support education entrepreneurs. Eric Oglesbee, thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
thanks, Carrie. It was great to be here.